Hello and welcome to the Occult Book Review. This week's book is The Supernatural, A New Vision of the Unexplained by Whitley Strieber and Jeffrey Kripal. The Supernatural is probably one of the biggest titles that will come out this year in paperback. So I'm sure a lot of people will be interested in this review. Well, that's kind of big-headed of me, but you know what I mean. The story of Whitley Strieber has been well documented. He is someone who went through very traumatic experiences and seemed to be pigeonholed into being considered an alien abductee. Now, as he says in the book quite a lot, he didn't really say that himself. He didn't really know what was going on, but it seemed to be the language that was used, the context that people wanted. So he kind of fell into that, and as a result, he became ostracized, really. He was very unkindly treated, unkindly reviewed as well, because when you look back on his books, they really are elaborate and very exploratory in terms of what he went through. It wasn't the usual abductee book. So this time he's in discussions with Jeff Kripal, who is a professor of religions. And Kripal comes up with some new ways of looking at what Strieber has gone through. He talks about comparison, first of all, comparing Strieber's experience to what we know, and can there be a kind of taint there? Are we kind of reflexively putting Strieber's experiences into a category with other experiences that we know? When this happens, Kripal asks us to make a cut, as he puts it, and what that means is basically to understand the kind of filters that are there, our biological filters, of course, in terms of what we can see, what we can experience. And I've spoken about that before. I've mentioned Evelyn Underhill, I've mentioned Henry Bergson, and even Huxley to some degree. I suppose the context, the historical context, is another thing that Kripal asks us to understand. So back in the 80s and 90s, if someone had these types of experiences, they were automatically considered alien UFO experiences. But if you go back 100 years, the same experience might have been put down to fairies. And if you go back further, of course, you could have it put down to angels and demons. And I was very struck with that idea, and it was something that I suppose Vallée has spoken about it recently. But I was going through this book here, which is Aboriginal Men of High Degree by A.P. Elkin, and some of the initiatory rites and the experiences that the indigenous Aboriginal people have gone through are basically the exact same experiences that Strieber is talking about here. He's talking about the Aboriginal experiences are talking about being taken up into the sky, into a cloud, being dissected, having magical stones put into your body, and then being sent down to earth again to be a healer, or to be different, to have powers. And that's really kind of the crux of the whole UFO abduction scenario, really, being taken up, being dissected, having probes, and having implants put into you, and then being brought back down again. So we have a type of back and forward where Strieber will talk about a particular aspect of his experience, and then Kripal will answer that. I won't say in a more academic fashion, but certainly he uses new ways of utilizing, I would imagine, academic structures that maybe weren't used by Strieber when he was initially talking about what he had gone through. So Kripal uses terms like interpretation and double imagination, practice and erotics, saying away, which is kind of like living with a paradox. And if you read a lot of occult works, you'll be familiar with that anyway. I suppose not understanding how something works and how it can be going against all the rules that are supposed to be there, but it works anyway. A very important part of the book is trance and trauma, and Then they talk about energetics, which is almost like traces left behind, energetic traces left behind after someone has gone through a particular unusual experience. And then the final new way of looking at what Strieber has gone through is saying again. And that's basically the most important part of the book, because Strieber is explaining what he has gone through, and then Kripal is saying, look, we need to step back from every single method of translation when it comes to our culture, our language, our religious forms, because whatever this is, it's been with us a long time, and it's bigger than anything that we can potentially ever imagine. So it kind of comes back to what he's saying again about making a cut, just understanding that you have these limitations and these filters that change whatever might be actually going on, and we make it conform to almost what we expect. I have to make sure I don't talk too much in this review, because it's one where you could really wander off on different tangents, because it covers so much ground that I'm particularly interested in, and I'm sure other people are too. The idea of shamanism alone, and comparing that to what UFO abductees say they're going through, that's like a book in itself, and it has been books in itself. But one of the important questions that Kripal asks is our own attitude to people like Strieber. Like, why can't he be a prophet? Why can't we accept that maybe he is telling the truth, but it's something that's so far outside of everyone else's experiences that we just can't give him that benefit of the doubt? So if you look at examples like Joseph Smith, even Jesus, who I don't believe was an historical figure, but just for the sake of this conversation, let's use him. So with that distance, there's a kind of respectability to those figures, and yet Strieber has gone through the same thing, and he is treated in a terrible, terrible way, and his ecstatic experiences are very, very similar. He says he's been taken away, he's had things done to him, he's coming back with new wisdom, he's trying to tell us about love and eros, and that's, as I've mentioned already, erotics plays a huge part in the book. So that's one interesting question. Kripal talks about Strieber's experiences with this feminine energy form, and he looks at it from the context of the divine feminine being oppressed and goddess forms being oppressed. And there's one striking moment in the book where Strieber says that he sees this energy form. I don't know what to call these creatures. I don't want to say aliens, but he sees the female who he's been having this kind of initiatory relationship with, and she has this child. And then Strieber also sees his wife, and it's like this triple goddess aspect, and it links back to religious forms, and this is what Kripal is getting at. So that idea of it's almost like love and sex are these kinds of mediums for whatever this thing is, replicating itself and advancing itself and manifesting and propagating into more complex forms. This idea is not new, of course. It's I think it's this book here, Symbols, Sex and the Stars, Ernest Busenbark. And of course the work of Crowley is very much like that as well. So we need to understand our own ideas of profanity and the filters again that we place in front of these things, because maybe there's much more to sex and love. It's very obvious that there is, but within the context of what people like Strieber are going through, and they get embarrassed about talking about it. Strieber says that quite a lot during the book. Kripal talks about it, an experience he had himself with a potential yogini. So that's one really important aspect, and again, I don't want to talk too much about that. I certainly don't want to tell everyone what some of the best scenes either, so I'll move on to a different aspect. Kripal does say that the history of religions is the history of weird sex and sex with demons and angels, and he's right. And especially even when you look at Christian saints, when they weren't able to talk about their experiences, and this is what I'm talking about when I'm saying the kind of society's profanity filters almost. So you have kind of saints talking about ecstasy and so on, but they're really talking about orgasms and being in contact with, they say, transcendent beings. So if we can overcome that reflex, Kripal says, and overcome our fear, potentially that's where our evolution is taking us. And the visitors, Strieber's visitors, make these kind of ambiguous remarks now and again about things like that. I think it was Peter Levenda in the third book in the Sinister Forces series. He puts it much better than I'm putting it now, but he talks about Crowley kind of saying the same thing, and Bruno also saying the same thing. These links, and they come from love, and if you can control your will and desire, that kind of magic ability is open to you. So that's an interesting aside. I suppose then one other aspect that people will find curious is I've said the visitors have said that they are us. So what does that mean? Does that mean that they're us from the future? Does it mean that we have a second self, as Kripal talks about, some kind of spiritual body? There's also the Charles Fort idea that we are the ones who are dead and they are the ones who are alive. So that's kind of another avenue you can go down, and in that context, the visitors then would be almost the equivalent of mediums in our cultures, where some people say that they can go off into other dimensions and contact beings there. It's almost like the visitors are doing the same thing here. And that would explain why, of course, that in certain instances Strieber is saying that they're in the room, he can see them, but someone else in the room can't see them. So we have this idea of either Strieber's being, his initiations are pushing those boundaries further. The trance and trauma that Kripal talks about, allowing Strieber to see things further, see things in a wider context and transcend the physical senses. Don't forget that kind of barrier that we have, which we've mentioned at the start. So again, I don't want to talk too much about the book. I don't want to talk about the conclusions. They do come to some kind of I won't say it's a conclusion, it's not, they examine one particular possibility, and it kind of comes out of the blue, if you'll pardon that pun, and they talk about energy being left behind and being able to see orbs, and they go through the history of orbs and maybe how they could be living things themselves, or possibly some kind of I suppose manifestation of something higher looking like an orb. And so they go through kind of Paul on the road to Damascus, UFOs, the way they kind of manifest themselves and disappear and behave like living things. So The Supernatural, A New Vision of the Unexplained by Whitley Strieber and Jeffrey Kripal. Very interesting book. As I've said already, I have to kind of cut this review down a bit, because I could talk about it for a long time. There are lots of different avenues you can explore, and having the dynamic of two different voices is very involving. There are times when Strieber is talking about what he's going through, and I found that I was quite cynical, and I was like, oh yeah, oh God, but that's kind of, I don't know, he's talking about gnomes and little blue men and so on. And then Kripal comes at it from a totally different angle, and you become much more open to what Strieber is talking about. And as Kripal says, it's your own cultural transforms that are holding you back in terms of being open to the possibility of these experiences being real. Not real in the way that we know it, but real in a form that's beyond our current comprehension, I suppose. So yeah, Supernatural, New Vision of the Unexplained, Whitley Strieber and Jeffrey Kripal. Highly recommended.